In recent times, say the last half-century or so, China has endured its past up until the point where it has been recognized as the second largest economy in the world today. For a sample size of the growth that occurred in the East Asian nation, we can take a look at the town of Shenzhen to see how the country grew. Once a small town of 330,000 across the border of Hong Kong, Shenzhen spent the next half-century taking advantage of China's new capitalist policies to trade and carry out business with the rest of the world. This helped the town develop into one of the largest and economically significant cities on the entire planet. In fact, in 2018, it surpassed the GDP of Hong Kong, which had a GDP in excess of $350 billion that year. To those who monitored the situation in China over the years, they'd realize that this isn't a peculiar situation to the country, as the country has seen the development and improvement of the lives of its citizens and cities over the years, while also accounting in several ways for the development of such things all over the world. That said, it seems as though this economic growth will not last forever. In a bid to sustain its economic growth, it seems like they focused on the short-term development of the country rather than their long-term sustainability. Now the long-term has arrived, and now China must deal with the consequences. In today's video, we're going to try and find out why China may be in trouble despite showing growth rates that may be commendable in other countries. Also, as things get cheaper due to their problems, why are economists concerned that this would make the Chinese economy worse? Additionally, if the country has low national borrowing rates, how can this create a debt crisis? Finally, is this panic justified, and is the fall of China's economy imminent? Join us as we take a look at the crumbling economy of China. Troubling growth rates. As much as people may want to hear that China may be crumbling, especially as it has a less than stellar reputation, especially with its human rights violations, we may have to tread carefully before we can fully accept that China's economic state may be in jeopardy despite it being the second largest economy in the world. However, we cannot ignore the fact that the country has actually suffered in recent times. Take a look at what happened to the entire world as a whole when it was struck by the COVID-19 pandemic. Considering that China had to adopt strict policies to ensure that the nation survived this disease, they had to accept that a majority of their economic activities had to take a back seat. Following the endurance of the last 3 years spent indoors, China was hoping to make a swift recovery following the end of the pandemic. Alas, China has not been able to recover exactly as they would have liked or predicted. This was especially telling when you consider that China was experiencing an annual growth rate of almost double figures to having to endure an annual growth rate of 5% today. Some may look at this as still being decent. At least the country is experiencing some economic growth. However, the experts are frantic because this tells them that some doom is imminent. Why exactly do they take this stance, especially when the country is experiencing some growth? Well, the truth of the matter is that 5% annual growth is low by China's standard. We say low by China's standard because other countries would have been ecstatic to experience a 5% annual growth rate. Apparently, most advanced Western countries hope to experience about 2% annual growth rate and would be happy for it if it did happen. So, how does this spell doom for China? To be honest, the simple answer is that this figure of 5% may simply fall short of expectations, especially when China was experiencing growth rates in the double figures. When China was experiencing regular growth with their GDP, this gave the nation and the businesses that thrive within it the ability to grow and improve their spending power as long as they were assured of maintaining this growth rate. That is why things like debt-to-GDP rate are important to consider when running a country. Believing that the country will be able to maintain the growth rate between 1980 and 2010, China has funded several projects that may be questionable to educated observers and laymen alike. Take the ghost cities that it sponsored for some years now. While some may snigger at such, others have also rightly pointed out that sometimes these ghost cities end up being thriving cities and communities. Nonetheless, what's important is that the government and private individuals alike did make heavy investment in things that they hoped would eventually pay off, ignoring any economic lapse that may occur as they wait for their returns. Unfortunately, they did not account for things like the pandemic or the fact that China's international migration rates from the country to major cities have experienced some decline in recent times. Furthermore, considering the fact that China seems to be experiencing a population decline for the first time in many years, such a drop in its economy should actually come as no surprise. As you can imagine, this has caused problems for China's economy across the board. Not only does real estate suffer due to this economic and population slump, many of its other projects were simply unviable for China at this point. Be that as it may, things may not have been so bad if not for the ever-growing Chinese debt. Debt crisis. Despite being considered prudent with its wealth, something that has helped China build the largest foreign reserves in the world, China cannot rest on its laurels because China also has a massive amount of debt waiting to be resolved. Right now, China's debt-to-GDP ratio is at about 77%, a reasonably healthy ratio, especially when you consider that the United States of America has a debt-to-GDP ratio of about 122%. Despite this, China still has a bit to worry about because when you consider the different factors of the debt as a whole, you'd see that China has a lot of work to do before it can claim that its economy may or may not be in trouble. For starters, while China has to deal with the national debt incurred by the national government, they also have to deal with the provincial debts, which may be the more troubling of the pair of debts, especially as the provinces may experience some insolvency due to the fact that they lack the authority to print money. As if that's not bad enough, it's been asserted that China may not even be able to keep track of this provincial debt exactly as they may like because these provinces have a tendency of reporting their debts and borrowings in different ways. Some of these provinces do not report to anybody but the central government, a move which has the potential of bringing disrepute to the Chinese government. Others seem to think that the solution to this problem is to find ways of preventing the government from finding out about these problems with their debts and borrowings by playing silly tricks like fixing props to show things are working on their provinces. Alas, this hasn't prevented Goldman Sachs from estimating that the total combined debts of these provinces may be at about $23 trillion, a sum that is effectively equivalent to 150% of the country's economic output. Let's also not forget that this is on top of the nation's 77% debt-to-GDP ratio. It's starting to look increasingly worrying by the second. Apparently, a chunk of the provincial debt was incurred to invest in the development of real estate and infrastructure like we asserted earlier. This was of course done with the hopes of making this money back when the investment started paying off. This phenomenon spread all through China, as none of the countries wanted to be left behind in this mass development scheme, and as such, they leased out state-owned land to land developers for a period that lasted anything between 70 to 99 years. As such, if they didn't get their returns, they were going to have to find a way to get that money they've lost, something that must make the hairs rise on the necks of the Chinese authorities. While this combined national and provincial debt may not be unique to China, as the US is actually in a similar predicament with its states, something that worries those watching is that this isn't the end of the problems for China. Apparently, China's borrowing to fund China is not centralized in the hands of the national government. Instead, it is done by thousands of state-owned companies. Alas, these companies have had a mixed record when it comes to its results and its use of the funds acquired. Take a look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which was supposed to boost trade for the nation. Instead, it seems to have developed into a debt manufacturing machine. Now abandoned, it tells a telling tale about how China is doing at the moment. Perhaps even more troubling, this is just one of many projects that are poised to experience some problems, especially as the world is waiting for things to get better. Rather than helping the country develop, it has just made their debt grow, and unless the country experiences a spike in its economic activities, it's only going to experience doom and gloom while things crumble before them, as China's state-owned company's debt grew to about $15.6 trillion, which somewhat increases the country's debt to $30 trillion. This takes us to the little guy who has invested a ton in some small properties, just to get the semblance of normalcy, if you will. While some did get some returns on their savings, many may be troubled by the depopulation problem and the fall of the value of their properties over time. These household debts further increase the debt burden to about 360% of its GDP, a frightening concept for those watching, and that's even without considering the effects of deflation in China. Deflation. As the country deals with the fact that things are getting cheaper in China, they must realize that something may need to be done before the shit hits the fan. As much as nobody likes inflation, because of inflation, deflation may be the sign of a deeper issue. Sure, things getting cheaper sounds great, but what we may not realize is that it may have been caused when consumers aren't spending like they normally would. This would force businesses to reduce their prices, which in turn could mean that they may eventually not be able to support their business. As such, it may make people even less willing to buy or invest in things as they wait to ride the waves of this instability. In China, this is already bad news because things are already relying on low-cost manufacturing. If the deflation gets worse, who knows how long they'd be able to maintain their dominance in several industries or maintain the country itself. Although nobody can predict the future, there is still time to turn their problems around. Hopefully, with time and the best economic practices, China will be able to revive its supposedly crumbling economy. With that, the video has come to an end. If you think China's bad, what do you think about the rising national debt in the US and why the country with the largest economy in the world won't pay off its debt? To learn more about this, why don't you watch our video, Why the US Won't Pay Down Its Debt? Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. With that, goodbye and see you next time.